Welcome back. It's great to have you with us. This next panel is in many ways the heart of the matter. We know that some 9 months after this coronavirus jumped from a bat into a human in Wuhan, China, that more than 881,000 people around the world have died. Tom Friedman aptly captured the speed with which this thing cast its shadow across the world in a New York Times op-ed a couple of months ago. The vastly expanded global network of planes, trains, and ships, combined with far too few buffers of global cooperation and governance, combined with the fact that there are almost 8 million people on the planet today, enabled this coronavirus to spread globally in the blink of an eye. As Friedman notes, and I quote, "Globalization is faster, deeper, cheaper, and tighter than ever before," close quote. This is particularly true with data. The amount of data zipping around the world today is increasing exponentially. But how we generate, share, and unleash that data into an actionable strategy for future pandemics, that is the conversation we're having today. Just before I turn it over to Eugene, I want to share with you the one question poll that we're inviting you to answer in the conference platform. Again, just go to the conference platform and look for the tab that says poll. What steps can be taken now to ensure that governments are armed with much better data and tech capabilities for meeting future pandemics? I promise you the results at the end of the session. I now turn it over to Eugene Kandel, Professor of Economics at Hebrew University and CEO of Startup Nation Central. Eugene, over to you.
Thank you, Wendy. Hello, everyone. It is my distinct pleasure to moderate this panel. I'm sure that I'm going to learn a lot, and I hope that you will too. We have the privilege of hosting in our Startup Nation Central studio, Dr. Michal Rosen-Zvi, Director, Health Informatics, IBM Research. Hello, Michal. Dr. Alan Tennenberg, Chief Medical Officer, Global Public Health, Johnson & Johnson. And joining us from the World Health Organization headquarters in Geneva, Dr. Peter Singer, the founder of Grand Challenges. Hi, Peter. And the special advisor to the Director General of the World Health Organization. It seems to an unprofessional observer that most countries' response to COVID-19 pandemic focuses on social distancing, masks, tests, and attempts to trace and quarantine contacts. Much of it is done manually by pretty scarce and overworked personnel. It's been done for decades and some of that for centuries. From all we see, it seems hard to say that we live in a digital age. Now, let's suppose that a couple of years ago, a woman from the future came to us and said that in a few years we'll be suffering worldwide pandemic, and we would have believed her. The question I'm posing today to our panel is what would have been done differently if we knew that? What would our playbook look like given our existing digital capabilities? So my first question today within such a scenario is to Peter. Peter, thank you for joining us from Geneva. I'm sure that in parts of the country's current response to Corona, many of them acted as if they heard that woman that predicted the pandemic. But in other parameters, we probably could have benefited from such prophecy. Can you give us a 30,000 feet overview of what worked well around the world, what we could have done better, especially in terms of better data?
Thank you, Eugene. I think, and it's very good to be with you. I think there's, you can think about the data opportunities and actually the fundamentals of the response in three categories. And in each, there's good practices, I think, that can be emulated, opportunities for improvement. Firstly is the foundations. This is the global solidarity, the national unity, the leadership at the national level and the global level, and also the communities and the trust and the engagement of communities. The type of information here is the type you hear in social media, the type you hear on television, the communication messages and the trust. Second category is you might think about the existing approaches and tools. At the heart of this, and this is what countries that have really done well have done, at the heart of this is testing, identifying every case and isolating every case, tracing contacts, quarantining contacts. That's a very data-rich exercise that relies a lot on public health workforce. It's absolutely at the heart of the response. And of course, also, as you mentioned, the surveillance and early warning, mask wearing, et cetera. That's the existing approaches. And then thirdly, it's the new tools and new approaches. And here we have things like the genomic data, the release of the genome, how that translates into diagnostic tests, the PCR test, for example, and how that can actually translate into some of the vaccine platforms as well. In each of these, there's examples of good practice, and I think there's opportunities for improvement.
Very, very diplomatic answer, the last point. Alan, what are your thoughts on this question, especially related to vaccines, since this is your specialty?
So first off, thank you for having me. Very happy to be here. I'm excited by your framing of the scenario, talking about a set of digital tools to help us prevent, detect, and respond to infectious disease threats all over the world. We would definitely use those tools to do a better job even of testing, tracing, isolating, since those are the fundamentals, and they worked centuries ago and they'll work in the future, and the digital tools will help us to do that better. When it comes to what works, I think that you mentioned vaccines. Peter mentioned the release of the genome, which happened in the second week of January, only weeks after the first cases of COVID-19 were identified. Making that genome public allowed scientists all over the world to identify not only targets for diagnostics, but also targets for vaccines. Within weeks, vaccine candidates were coming out of the laboratory and entering into preclinical studies. And now, about 8 months later, there are over 320 vaccine candidates that are in studies. Approximately 10% of those, 32, exactly 10% of those, are now in human testing, and 6 of those are in large late-phase studies of 20,000 volunteers or more to prove, first off, efficacy, but most importantly, safety. This has never been done so quickly, but the focus on safety has never been so great. These developments are coming out of small companies, large companies, academic institutions, government laboratories. The degree of collaboration across these institutions is unprecedented, and the degree of collaboration between governments, funders, regulators, international organizations like the WHO is also unprecedented, and that's why we've been able to move so incredibly quickly. Some of that is based on developments that have taken place since the Ebola outbreak of West Africa in 2014 to 2016. An organization was founded called CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, which exists in order to accelerate the development of vaccines so that we can address these infectious disease threats more rapidly. One of their 3 foundational pillars is, in fact, to identify or prepare for unknown threats like COVID-19, and to have platforms that are already being advanced and tested so that vaccines can be developed more quickly than ever in the event that some unknown pathogen emerges. And that's exactly what happened now. So there's certainly been innovation on the vaccine front. That story is still unfolding, but those innovations have placed us in a far better place than we would have been without them.
So Ebola essentially served as this woman coming from the future and warning us.
In some respects, so did H1N1 swine flu in 2009. There's been no dearth of pandemics and epidemic threats over the last centuries and also decades.
I remember that one. That came the first week, me being on the job at the Prime Minister's office, so I had to deal with that. So it was, to follow up with you, just a sort of addition to this. So the platform for vaccines was prepared and actually sped up the data accumulation and the preparation of vaccines as well as tests. What other data can be used or prepared for to allow us for building a probabilistic models of possible outbreaks?
So there are extensive systems that are out there already to gather information and data around disease outbreaks. You have reports of individual diagnoses, cases, if there's a rabies case or a measles case or an Ebola case, that get fed into public health authorities. There are also surveillance systems for syndromes. clusters of symptoms without necessarily a diagnosis. So fever, aches, and headache, and shortness of breath would be a syndrome. The symptoms of, say, an encephalitis, a brain infection, would be a syndrome. Syndromes are identified at healthcare facilities in countries and all over the world, and they're also fed into central repositories at the country level. There are international systems that lay on top of that. For example, systems that the WHO run that have actually been revamped just over the last couple of years, that gather all that aggregate information from open sources and then process it and analyze it to see what the signals look like. But there are also non-traditional sources of data that we need to be thinking about more and more. Internet searches for symptoms or diagnoses or treatments. There are cell phone data that can tell us more about human migration, where people are moving from place to place. There were even reports that the parking lots at the hospitals in Wuhan might have actually been over full already in August or September. So is that a real signal? Is it noise? But we need to be able to gather all that information and then have new tools, new ways of analyzing it to see what's real and what's not. And that should help us to be more efficient and forward-looking when it comes to first identifying and then also predicting.
So Michal, that leads me to you, because data is your specialty. So how can you take all these amazing data that exists somewhere about parking lots in Wuhan or cargo ships or searches on the internet, from healthcare systems, social networks, or international organization, Google's, etc. How do you put this together, especially at the time of need? How do you analyze all of this? How do you create some kind of depository? Where could it be? Because data in pieces, it's not particularly worth much, but data has to be analyzed jointly. How do you do that?
Yes, so like Peter said, like Alan said, sorry, we are looking into genotypic, phenotypic, and behavioral, these three types of data of interest in order to control the disease. The genotypic is obviously for the vaccine development and drug development, and the phenotypic is to understand how to treat the disease and the level of disease individual-wise and population-wise. And the behavioral is very important also for understanding how to control the spread of the disease. And information can be collected in all of these levels, and we have focused on collecting information related to behavioral. And as we've seen in this specific pandemic, the whole world took actions, different governments and regions, and there were interventions where there was a request to stop doing some things. We know that there was the self-quarantine, there were these requests of not gathering too many people at the same place, all of them aiming at controlling the behavioral aspect of human in order not to spread the disease. At IBM, we realized that it's important to collect this information, and that the diverse information that appears in each and every country appears in the different languages in the countries and is recorded in a free language. And we put as an aim to collect this data in an integrated way so that we can understand the interventions being performed in each and every country and compare and contrast in order to learn from that. And we have created a database, we call it WinTrack because it's non-pharmaceutical interventions, NPIs, that we collect worldwide in order to track over time how they are being implemented and imposed in different locations. This is one IT company collecting one type of data. Of course, other IT companies like Google and Apple collected other very relevant data like mobility that can be integrated together. And we all open source the data as a reaction to this situation in order to make it available and for different actors to be able to benefit from that and learn from that how to control the disease.
So this is interesting because, but there are many different, like 3 different types of data, and you have access only to the open one. You have open access data to some parts of it. Google has to others, Facebook has to others, etc. Peter, I would like to ask you, you are now at the World Health Organization. It seems to, again, from very far away and not very knowledgeable about how WHO operates, it could be considered a reasonable or logical candidate to gather the genotypic, the phenotypic, and the behavioral data from all the players, at least at the times of need, and to create some kind of depository that would be putting it all together and letting some, either pre-vetted or pre-qualified analysts to work with it to derive certain predictions, etc. Can WHO be in this position? What is the WHO position on that issue?
So, Eugene, there's no question that these global problems and challenges require global solutions, that WHO is relevant to every country, and that it's actually been, I think, very important in this outbreak. It has, remember, WHO is not only the Secretariat, like me, but also the member states. And there's an agreement called the International Health Regulations, where member states essentially agreed to report cross-border serious threats that could constitute a public health emergency of international concern. And that's a very valuable system. In terms of what WHO does, it really does three things. It does leadership. It does what we call global goods, norms, and standards, which, to your question, could form the architecture or the standards, if you will, of such a system that you're describing. And thirdly, it does support to countries, including and especially country governments. So putting all that together, it's unlikely that WHO would have a central repository of information. It is likely that it could help lead the development of such a set of open standards, set the standards, working with countries, and support governments to help implement. And again, at the heart of this response has been information. It's in each country, finding where the virus is at, who it's in, isolating the cases, tracing and quarantining the contacts. That is at the heart of the response and has been really the difference between very robust and less robust responses. It's very much an information problem in that way. And WHO's leadership, standards, and support to country governments, all governments, can help.
So it almost looks like the CEPI that, Alan, you were talking about, that was created to facilitate the speedy process of creating vaccines, et cetera. It's an outside of WHO, but it's I presume it's affiliated, and so maybe there is a need for something like that in this space, in the space of coordinating data and creating a platform that data can flow to, and a lot of people can work on it. Would it be reasonable to assume that something like that can be established?
So there's always the conflict between creating something new and leveraging what already exists. Perhaps we do need something new. In fact, there is an initiative that is co-founded by both the WHO and the World Economic Forum that does exactly what we're talking about, which is convening parties across this data universe and bringing them together with public health officials in order to find better ways to use data to predict and not to do surveillance, but also to predict where epidemics may go. It has a long acronym. I'm going to try to remember it. The Epidemic, Big Data, Resources and Analytics Innovation Network, EpiBrain. It is still a work in progress. It was kicked off in 2019 with a series of consultations through the year. Obviously, 2020 has been a different sort of a year where the need is greater than ever, but the ability to organize sometimes is diverted. The attention is diverted to other priorities. But something like that, using the convening power of the WHO, the leadership, plus other interested parties and organizations, might be able to create the necessary ecosystem.
Would IBM be a good candidate to coordinate something like that? To maybe participate or not?
I can't really commit anything.
No,
at this
of course I
time,
can, but it looks
definitely
like, at least from my,
Yes.
not professional view, it seems like something that you would be good at. Your team could be a strong candidate for that.
We're definitely
You don't
aligned.
have to answer that.
No,
know
I can say that we are definitely aligned with the type of things that the WHO organizes, and we work with them on the genotypic side of the virus. We shared and reshared the data of the virus genome with the WHO, so we definitely aligned on that. And I've learned about this platform, and I think it's a very good one. It takes time to put everything at the same place, but working with open standard, as Peter said, that's what we are doing. That's what we are doing now, and that's how we are aiming in order to be able to integrate with others.
This is, Peter, I want to complete that point that you were making about sort of standards and this international health regulation. There are certain countries that have very strong healthcare systems and very strong, CDCs type of organizations. But there are many countries, majority of countries in the world have much weaker systems. So but we all live in the very connected world. So if the pandemic starts in some place which is weak and is not discovered for a long time, we all have a problem. How would you see sort of what needs to be done to strengthen that, at least the sentinel type of activities in those countries for the benefit of those countries, but also for the rest of the world?
Thank you. And this is also relevant as we build back from COVID, because one day it will end, and the resilience of health systems, primary health care, universal health coverage will be extremely important in the building back agenda. But to your question, it's true. If you just look at the, let's say, mortality rates across different countries, they really do vary quite a bit. And I'm sure a number of factors go into that. But I think one of the lessons is part of the story is about capacity, and you were talking about capacities in terms of health systems. I would also emphasize the public health capacity, because at the heart of this, it's the public health workforce, it's the contact tracing, et cetera, that's enabled by technology. And then secondly, it's how you use that capacity. And when you actually look at the mortality rates, there's some surprises. There's some countries, for example, with very strong capacity that have higher mortality rates, and some with relatively lower capacities that have relatively low mortality rates. And so it's not a simple picture. WHO, actually the member states, have launched an independent panel co-chaired by the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, former President of Liberia, that are taking a close look at the international response, including WHO's response. And I think some of these trends and issues will be very much at the fore. But I just want to say it's not only the capacity, it's also how you use it, which goes back to those foundational issues I talked about: leadership, valuing evidence, valuing science, and really having a robust, data-driven, science-driven, public health-oriented response, which, until we have a vaccine, is where we really should be focused to save lives.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to say something that is a bit different, but we've seen an interesting development that the politics in various countries, including our own, seems to intervene in the decisions of, you were talking about leadership, but leadership is a political process. So we've seen this intervene, and that sort of sometimes undermines the public trust in the required measures. And when the fact that the media sometimes brings all kinds of different opinions and presents them as logical, equally relevant and equally legitimate, creates more confusion. So there has been issues that may require, at least in my opinion, and I'm not going to ask you guys about this, but there may be issues that need to be legislated ahead of pandemics, so that during the pandemic, when certain measures are taken, they're taken almost automatically. If you reach certain thresholds of data, you have to do 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's not a political decision because it's been legislated long ago. So there's something to be because in some sense, when there are like natural disasters and wars, we seem to have a very, very strong response that is not related to politics in most cases. But with the pandemic, there seems to be much more vision. Again, I didn't want to put anyone on the spot on this. This is sort of my personal view. Ellen, I have a question for you. So suppose we have a common worldwide playbook, and every country has its own playbook based on data. Let's take a single country. What do you think, what kind of data, what kind of evidence, in your opinion, should trigger the activation of such playbook if we legislated it ahead of time? Let's say we wanted to prepare this. If something happens, you don't even have to push the button. The computer pushes the button and it all goes in place. So to what extent, first of all, what data should it be, and would it help if this was really purely automatic? That doesn't involve any sort of decision making and et cetera. Is it feasible at all?
So in every country is different. Let's start with that. The notion of having a national level playbook or response manual makes a lot of sense. In fact, many countries have them and use them. You can go online to the Singaporean Ministry of Health site and download a PDF document of a 32-page playbook that defines who makes the decisions, who's in charge, command and control, testing, how you deal with crowds, how you deal with schools, how you deal with public transportation. There is a beautiful color-coded chart about what triggers what sort of responses, very reminiscent of the traffic light system that we've been arguing now for quite some time about whether or not we should implement here in Israel. It's all there. The types of information, I think that sometimes these outbreaks begin in a country, but sometimes they don't. They begin far away elsewhere in the world. So there needs to be international interplay. There needs to be that global oversight and coordination. There needs to be a global declaration, and there needs to be some sort of centralized identification of signals. These diseases, as we saw with COVID, travel very, very quickly from place to place. Should it be automatic? I really think you need to have public health officials and experts looking at the information that's coming in, sharing information and comparing across borders with their colleagues, and then making decisions about what needs to be done and when. And those signals would be an outbreak of a syndrome somewhere in the world. This time around, it was an unexplained pneumonia in parts of China. With Ebola outbreaks, it was a hemorrhagic fever in Western Africa. So the signals that would trigger response may be different from time to time, but I think that you can't take the public health expertise out of the system. I think that it remains a critical component.
So what you're saying is that actually the example that you gave of Singapore is a predetermined. Mm-hmm. It's not that we're going to decide how to do it. This is how you're going to do it. There may be variations, but it's pretty predetermined. But
it's dated 2014, the Singapore document.
So the women from the future came to them.
And they're not the only ones. Now, they had the experience of SARS. They've had experience in the past that motivated them to get ahead of this.
Although the number of dead during SARS was minimal. I mean, it was the potential.
But with a 10% fatality rate, imagine COVID with a 10% fatality rate and the impact that it would have on the world.
Yeah, that's the benefit of being scared enough. I mean, that's one of the things that we...
Scared or very alert.
Well, yeah, first scared, then alert. So, Peter, you just mentioned that we've seen a dramatic variation in terms of infection and mortality across countries. You know, following our discussion, I actually went and looked, and they go by the order of magnitude of 1 to 100. This is really, really quite amazing. You've explained it to some extent by sort of infrastructure and the leadership, et cetera. But do you think that these, to some extent, can be alleviated by the use of technology and data sort of more uniformly, so that the leadership, while important, will be based everywhere on similar data?
Yeah, I think, and it ties into what you've just been speaking about as well. You know, it's important to realize this is the worst public health crisis in 100 years, probably since 1918. And the reason is that COVID spreads fast, it's a killer, and we're learning every day. So on the one hand, it's important to have the playbook, and WHO embraces the after-action reviews, the tabletop exercises, does one after every major event. On the other hand, and this gets to your point, the countries that have done the best have been those which have had data-driven adaptive responses. So there also needs to be ongoing learning as the exercise unfolds, driven by data, driven by knowing where the virus is, how to isolate the cases, how to trace and quarantine the contacts. And that's really at the heart of the response. And it's also, to Alan's point, the lesson learned from SARS. So I think that's at the heart of the variation. Once you go beyond some of those foundational issues, as you mentioned, of leadership, of global solidarity, national unity, community trust, those are the foundations. But then we're into the heart of the existing approaches, and that has to do with finding the virus, isolating the cases, quarantining, tracing the contacts, and that requires a public health workforce to do so.
Thank you, Peter. Michal, so Peter was talking about data-driven adaptive responses as being sort of driving the differences 1 to 100 in terms of mortality per million people. This variability implies that learning best practices may be pretty useful in saving a lot of people. So how do you do that? How do you actually learn about best practices when things are developing so fast and in 190 countries, or you can even split some countries into regions? You can learn a lot from those. How do you do that? I understand that you have something that have been sort of going towards that goal.
Yes, we created a system that I think I can show, that I can share the link and everybody can go through and analyze. And in that system, we show per country how many people are either confirmed with the virus or death out of the population. And we can show what were the interventions that country took in place. And we divided the world into different type of interventions. So we have interventions that are related to travel and interventions that are related to the community. Mass gathering restrictions are related to the community, travel quarantine, travel. And we also, so this is the data that is available, and we assembled that through analyzing free text from Wikipedia, so that we have everything that the Wikipedia volunteers wrote down with respect to all the many different countries. And we've shown what happens in different countries with respect to how early did they react to this disease. And you can see with respect, when you compare to the first day that they have 50 confirmed cases and the first day that they have someone who died. And actually what you mentioned with respect to Singapore is very clear from the data as well, where we can show, and you can see in this slide, that fairly early, the Singapore government reacted by putting people on quarantine and stopping some of the flights. And if you can see in the slide, the blue bar and the red dot shows how early before the first day of death or the first day of 50 confirmed cases, a government intervened. And we've seen the travel-related intervention happened early in Israel, happened early in Singapore, and indeed the first wave in Israel was well controlled. Unlike places like Portugal or Spain, where it was very late, they were very late to the game, and you see a much bigger first wave. So this way of collecting data enables us and others to compare and contrast and learn from the data.
That is very interesting. I spoke to a friend of mine from Singapore, and he said that SARS is actually basically edged in their cortex of even though this is something that really affected their behavior. It was quite so. So at the end of the session, we're actually going to provide the link to the website, and this data, as I understand, is open. You can, apart from user-friendly interface, you can actually use this data, download, etc. So now the fact that so many people actually don't believe that this disease is dangerous. A lot of people, we see protests all over the world, including in Israel. or that the tools that you've been prescribing or discussing that not effective, indicates to me at least that the communication efforts are not either insufficient or ineffective. Or maybe this has to do with the politics, but let's put the politics aside. And so the question is why? That is something that I would like to Peter and Alan to answer. It seems that in many places the government and the public seem like adversaries. It's like the government is imposing things on the public that the public doesn't want to do, and feels that there was a demonstration I saw in Germany when they were saying this is invasion of our democratic rights. You know, the attempt to actually prevent these people from being sick, you know, it's hard to describe as invasion of democratic rights. And yet this is something that is happening. So I don't think there is enough effort to massively educate, explain, and engage the community, which Peter, you mentioned that. But what I'm interested now is, you know, going backwards is probably hard to do. So if we go forward, we have a big hurdle. Suppose the vaccine comes tomorrow, you know, there's going to be a huge issue between people who would want it first and between people who would not want it at all. How do you go about communicating this and explaining and educating so that this whole process of vaccinating the population of the entire world, basically, as fast as possible, takes place smoothly? Alan, let's start with you.
So it's a critical issue, clearly. People's lives and livelihoods have been disrupted. On top of that, though, behavior changes in public health take time to bring to the forefront and to get people to adhere to, and we don't really have a lot of time. Certainly the issue of resistance to vaccines is a critical one and a dangerous one, because ultimately that could prolong the period of time that we're dealing with this pandemic. Some of those efforts around vaccine acceptance have already begun. When I spoke about vaccines back in your first question, you might have noticed that I went out of my way to emphasize that safety has been the number one focus of the developers. I work for one of those developers, and I can tell you that the emphasis on safety is above and beyond. I think emphasizing to people and educating them now that doing this quickly doesn't mean that it's not being done in a careful way. Those messages have to be crafted, and they have to be brought out in a comprehensive and widespread way, but also in a way that gets down deep into communities and is communicated in the right language, in ways that are culturally appropriate and culturally sensitive. Otherwise, we'll have a difficult time when we start to introduce these vaccine products broadly at a scale that we've really never done before, under time pressure and under circumstances where the stakes are very high.
So, Peter, from the point of view, the same question, but from the point of view of WHO, I presume the WHO sort of has some kind of game plan on how to roll out, because WHO usually when there are pandemics controls sort of the distribution of vaccines to some extent. How do you think, or what is that plan, whatever you can share, and how long from the time that vaccine appears would it take to get enough people to be vaccinated?
Thank you, Eugene. I mean, I'll just reiterate something that the Director General said, which is that WHO won't validate a vaccine unless it's safe and effective. So that's the first point to make. WHO actually has been very involved in this very important area of new tools, drugs, diagnostics, and vaccines through something called the Access to COVID Tools Accelerator, and working with partners like CEPI, and which was mentioned before, and Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, also the COVAX facility. WHO is trying both to accelerate the development of vaccines through, for example, making sure the manufacturing is ready when a candidate's successful, but also very importantly to make sure that the vaccine's equitably distributed. Because none of us is safe until all of us are safe, and that's a very, very keen focus of WHO. To your question of timing, The COVAX facility aims to access 2 billion doses by the end of 2021. The expectation is that doses will begin arriving in countries in mid-2021. And of course, we all hope that this happens as quickly as possible. But we have to have a vaccine that's safe and effective.
Yeah, that's amen, as they say. I'm going to summarize this this session and then go to some questions from the audience. So we basically have, since we didn't have the woman from the future arrive 2 years ago, in some cases we do seem that we are prepared because of certain earlier pandemics, because of some countries were more sort of tuned into this process, and they can share what they learned and what worked through your platform with others, and through WHO with support. We do need to create some kind of support for the overall healthcare system, so that sentinel activity in all places around the world, especially in more exotic places where exotic things like that can appear, and a lot of it will have to rely on data and the platforms that we need to build bigger and more integrative platforms that will require during times of need a huge integration of various sources of data, whether genotypic, phenotypic, behavioral, and others, economic probably, to actually be reasonably efficient in preventing and then fighting and treating the pandemic victims. So I'm being told that we have a question, which the first question is, you've addressed this to some extent, but the first question, when will the vaccine for COVID be ready for delivery? Your wild guesses. Alan.
So, Peter mentioned that the COVAX facility is anticipating delivery of vaccines in mid-2021. I think that's a very realistic time frame. It's certainly possible that a vaccine may receive an emergency use authorization before that, based on good data, positive data coming out of the large safety and efficacy studies, and show solid safety. But remember, we're talking about a scale-up right now that's at a scale that we really haven't dealt with before. Peter mentioned, I think the number was 2 billion to deliver to COVAX through 2021. Those numbers are staggering, and that's a quarter of the world's population. One interesting thing to accelerate this and make it possible is that the developers are manufacturing at risk before they get authorization to deliver. They already are scaling up their capabilities so that they can produce, so that approval or emergency authorization to delivery time is shortened as much as possible.
Peter, when you're talking about the production facilities, just to follow up to this question, the production facilities around the countries, do you see establishment of new production facilities, let's say spread out more widely? Let's say, I'll just wild guess, suppose that a company X would put a production facility in Israel, so to serve the region here or somewhere in the vicinity, rather than being sort of more concentrated as they usually are. Do you see any of that happening?
These are obviously individual country and company decisions, but WHO can help coordinate. Remember, there's also different platforms, as Alan mentioned earlier, that require different production facilities. What I would do is encourage all countries to look very seriously at the COVAX facility and to join and to advocate for it. It's really something that's gaining momentum, and it's something that will be very important to help the world get over this as soon as possible. Could I just go back to one other thing before we close, Eugene, which is this point about that Alan made, that this is a problem not only of lives, but also of livelihoods. It's a very serious economic issue, and the solution to the economic issue is to solve the public health issue. And that's why The vaccine rollout is so important, and it's why until there is a vaccine, keeping the focus on those public health tools is so important. And in that regard, I just wanted to add that the precision approach to this is finding every case, isolating every case, tracing and quarantining every contact. The blunt force approach to this is the so-called lockdowns. And we can avoid lockdowns by doing better precision work. And that has, of course, a smaller effect on the economy. And the action that individuals can take is to wear masks.
And as economists, I can tell you that, the amount of damage that has been done to the economy, I think a single country, damaged countries the size of Israel, the damage is probably bigger than the entire world preparedness in terms of data and vaccine. So this is just staggering in terms of, so that is something that we need to think about. And another question that we have from the audience is that we have many startups from Israel and many other countries in the audience. And so many ask, what would be your recommendation, Michal, where to put their efforts to be the most productive in this space, but also to find clients? Who would be the possible clients for their data-related, software-related activities that can facilitate these solutions?
Some of the messages that were here by Peter and Alan were clear about the importance of science and between studying from new things versus and from scratch versus reusing. It's clear that we need to be very keen to stick to the science and to really reuse technologies. And I think that the startups in Israel generate amazing technologies and can benefit a lot from what the big companies made available for free, and learn how to support this big fight through the specific pockets that they focus on. And what's unique in startups setting is that they are laser focused on clear targets. And they can help us in many, many different ways. And I don't want to name startups or to name examples, but I think we've already seen very advanced technologies coming out of startups that help the disease.
We definitely see, thank you, Michal, we definitely see a wide variety. Just to sort of illustrate, when Startup Nation Central mapped the COVID-relevant startups in March, there were about 80 of them. Today, we're mapping about 330, close to 350, sort of they vary. And this is not window dressing. These are real products. There are companies that were founded a few months ago. They already have products. These are companies that pivoted, companies that adapted their product to these users. It's quite amazing. So we have a lot of hope for that. So I would like to thank all three of you. Michal, thank you so much. Alan, Peter, thank you for joining us from Geneva. And back to you, Wendy.
Thanks, Eugene. Please welcome Yoav Bar-Lev, who's the Strategic Partnerships Manager at Startup Nation Central. Yoav, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you, Wendy.
And thanks for putting together such a unique collection of panelists to take on this critical topic.
It's my pleasure.
I have to say, listening to Michal and Peter and Alan go at it with Eugene, there's a pretty clear message. I think Peter was the one that just put it out there. Global challenges require global solutions. Now, if there ever was a case for a playbook, I think you heard it just now. In fact, I found it fascinating the way that Alan from Johnson & Johnson spoke about this PDF, this 32-page PDF document that anyone can download from the Singapore Ministry of Health website, and it's all there. It's just this actionable strategy for dealing in great detail with the pandemic.
Yeah, in Israel, we often talk about innovation born of necessity. And unfortunately for Singapore, this is a good example since their experience with SARS before then.
Absolutely. No, it really does give us something to think about, and a lot of the issues that Eugene went through in terms of how much can be legislated and all the different things that need to be balanced, one against the other. I just want to go back, though, to the underlying theme of that entire conversation, we just heard, which is data.
Mm-hmm.
And data is playing a bigger and bigger role in our lives. What can you share with us about the kind of data that Startup Nation Central has on the Israeli tech ecosystem?
Yeah, so Startup Nation Central is and always has been a data-driven organization. Data is the baseline of our activities. A good example are the sector-specific and macro-level reports, which we publish several times a year. Just to give you some context, these reports provide a real window to the market developments, hot trends, and collaboration opportunities available to multinational corporations looking to engage with Israel's tech sector.
So how do you go about gathering all the data for these reports?
Right. So our flagship product is the Startup Nation Finder platform. This is an online database that's mapping the entire Israeli tech ecosystem. On there you have the startups, the investors, MNCs, hubs, all in one place, each one having a unique profile with lots of informative information about their activities here in Israel. More importantly, anyone in the world can access this data for free, and within a few clicks, they can generate a list of startups that are relevant to their needs, their target investment, or corporate challenges. Indeed, we see that most of the people using the platform are coming from outside of Israel.
Well, it's not surprising if you're talking about a country with 6,500 startups and innovative companies, it's not surprising that such a platform would indeed contain a lot of data. We're actually going to share with our listeners from around the world 3 examples of startups that are on the Finder platform that are super relevant to what we just discussed. The first one is called Soapy, and all I can really say about Soapy at the moment is who can think of anything more important right now than hand hygiene? So I'm pleased to welcome Max and Netta, who are going to share with us what Soapy has to offer.
Wendy, you're absolutely right. If you think about hand wash intervention is probably one of the most important things that happened in the healthcare history that was led by Ignaz Semmelweis more than 150 years ago. Soapy's core vision was from the beginning to prevent illnesses through hand wash and hand hygiene. Think about that through the 21st century.
Well, even now in the 21st century, we have hidden challenges in hand washing. It's difficult to know the frequency and the quality of the wash cycles performed. And this is exactly the challenges that we want to address using AI technology and machine learning.
Imagine yourself a friend that can really guide you through the process. 21st century friend, a robot that can use the computer vision technologies, machine learning and AI algorithms and support you through the process, guide you how to scrub hands, how to use soap, lather them, time, water volumes and everything. At the same time, that specific friend will give you a feedback saying, hey Max, or hey Netta, you're washing your hands in a good way today. If you think about it, if you have hands, you probably need to wash them, right?
Yeah. We want to thank Startup Nation Central for their ongoing support and for helping get our product out there to the countries that really need it. Thank you, and don't forget to wash your hands.
Thank you, Max and Netta. You're very welcome. So now we're going to hear from a startup called Clue, which actually harnesses AI to help medical teams make better informed clinical decisions for patient care. We're being joined by Dr. Itai Pesach.
Thank you, Wendy, for the intro. Clue Medical is a startup company that was established in 2015. We're all about harnessing the artificial intelligence and its power in caring for patients within hospitals. Actually, our first product is aimed at the critical care departments, where we provide algorithms that predict the deterioration of patients that are cared for there. These algorithms allow physicians to know what's going to happen a long time before it actually happens, and thus provide interventions early on and improve the course of the patient's stay in the hospital. As the COVID pandemic started and actually the first patients arrived to Israel. We immediately mobilized our technical teams to install the system in the two largest hospitals in Israel in their corona critical care units. And actually within a very short time, we had the system up and running, and we found out that our models that were actually developed not for COVID patients can actually provide a lot of help to the physicians caring for these patients in predicting these patients' deterioration. This is especially important in these times of a pandemic where physicians need to triage patients and actually choose who needs critical care and who doesn't. We are also very happy to be part of the SNC ecosystem, where we are inspired every day into looking to the future and seeing how we can really improve our product and do a better job.
Thanks for joining us. Our final startup for this afternoon is actually an interesting one in the area of regenerative medicine. This is actually becoming pretty hot, actually, during COVID. And now I'm going to invite Zami Aberman to share with us about Pluristem.
Thank you, Wendy, for the opportunity. In Pluristem, we are acting in the regenerative medicine space. We collect cells from the placenta after birth, and we have a unique manufacturing and proprietary technology that converts them into a unique therapeutic. Currently, we are running 2 phase 3 studies. The cells have a unique property. Those unique properties, which are immune modulation property, give the ability to those cells to reduce the cytokine storm associated with the COVID-19 and to help the patient to recover quicker and better. In May, we announced 28 days follow-up of COVID-19 patients treated with our PLX cells. And we reported 87.5% survival, 75% of patients become ventilation-free. As of today, we run the compassionate use programs in US and Israel, and recently we have been approved by the FDA to conduct an expanded access program for COVID-19 patients. We at Pluristem harnessing our technology, capabilities, unique cell source that may bring hope to all those COVID-19 patients.
Zami, thanks for joining us, and congratulations on the FDA approval. That's really something. Now it's our turn to carry out what we promised, which is the results from the poll question at the beginning of the session. Just to remind you, the question that we put to you: what steps can be taken now to ensure that governments are armed with much better data and tech capabilities for meeting future pandemics? So let's take a look at the results. 68% said that we need to digitize government and healthcare services to gather, aggregate, and analyze data. 22% said that we need to ensure privacy regulations that will allow the gathering of far more data as a pandemic intensifies. And 10% believe that we need to create challenges for the tech sector around pandemics. Now, I just want to take a minute to note about this sense about digitizing healthcare services and other government agencies. That's been a real priority for the Israeli government for about 6 or 7 years now. There was an agency created called Digital Israel, which then joined the D8, which are all the other countries around the world that are doing a similar process. I believe the D8 has now gone up in numbers, but this is definitely a national priority here. Just to remind you that we have created a super interesting expo where there are some 55 startups with technologies that run across many different sectors. And all you need to do is go out of the full screen to the conference platform, and you will see a tab that says on it Startup Expo. And what's, in this case, taking advantage of our online situation is you don't need to wait in line to speak to these entrepreneurs. You can just sign in and set up your B2B meetings with a few clicks. So invite you to go ahead and do that. Yoav, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And I just want to remind our listeners from across the globe that tomorrow at 4 p.m. Israel time, we have 2 panels to share with you. The first is creating a social contract between the high-tech sector and society. And then at 6 p.m. Israel time tomorrow, the new digital age, economic, social, and political aspects which will be a fireside chat between Dan Senor and Professor Larry Summers. We hope you'll join us tomorrow. Thank you very much.